All right. So, welcome to another Align Online session. This one is called Stories, an informal discussion around mental health for first generation low income students. That was not exactly the title, but that's what I remember of it. So, it's the three of us facilitating today are going to be Jay and Siobhan from the Steve Fund and me from Align. Jay, do you want to start by introducing yourself as well as the Steve Fund?
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Jay. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am the current chair for the Steve Fund Youth Advisory Board. So the Steve Fund is the only nonprofit currently in the US that primarily targets the mental health and emotional well-being of students of color. And by extension, the Youth Advisory Board is composed of high schoolers, graduate and undergraduate students, and some recently graduated students to kind of advise the Steve Fund and some of their programmings, support students as they create their own programs on their own campuses, and have similar conversations in regards to their experiences um, with their mental health. Yeah.
Cool. And Siobhan, do you want to go introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Siobhan, and I am also a member of the Youth Advisory Board for the Steve Fund. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a medical student, and so there's been a lot of different things that have come up mental health-wise for me during that time. And so I'm just here to talk about my experiences and hear what everyone else has to say.
Sweet. Thanks for joining us. I'm Chris, he, him, his, co-founder of Align, current co-executive director. Uh, and Yeah, Align started in 2017 with its first conference. Um, and since then, we've had 3 in-person conferences. We would have had a 4th one in Richmond, hosted by Virginia Commonwealth University and the University of Richmond, but that was canceled because of the pandemic. And so now we're having an online limited webinar series, and this will be the last one aired in public. Um, we'll have possibly another one, but that's going to be a closed door one. So uh, personally, I guess I graduated in 2017 from Columbia University and from Georgetown with a dual bachelor's from those 2 schools. And I will be starting this fall at University of Florida in their astronomy department as a PhD student. Okay, so that's us. Again, welcome. Thank you for joining us. So our format is so Steve Fund will be the Steve Fund will be taking the driver's seat in steering this session. So I'm going to actually just let Jay be the main moderator, but the 3 of us, Siobhan, Jay, and I, will be sharing our stories as part of the session. So Jay, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Chris. And before we start, I think I want to kind of highlight like why is it really important to talk about mental health? Right? There are of course like socio-political factors, environmental factors that are affecting students, but I think mental health is still a topic for a lot of minority populations. That's a stigma, unfortunately. And there's still kind of a mystique or kind of like an unknown that exists in terms of like what happens when you go into counseling. What exactly is self-care, right? Like we have these stories where people are like, oh, I just see my like counselor, my therapist, like every other week. And some people are like, oh, if you go into therapy, it's like a one all like wham bam, you're done. But no, like right, like counseling is kind of a process. You have to go through it, and mental health is similar to that as well. Um, in addition to that, I think it's really important to be active in terms of like having these spaces because there's still a lot of misusage of verbiage regarding mental health. Like, oh, like I'm so OCD. It's like, are you? I'm so bipolar. Mm, not really. Um, and then there's also, oddly enough, that I've noticed on social media, a weird sense of romanticization of like having mental health issues. Like, having anxiety or living with depression and etc. And I find it very strange. And I think like having more of these conversations kind of shines a light on it and really goes into like, is that really something that you're going through, or is it just because you're misusing the words that have been like used traditionally? And then on top of that, I think one of the other important things is like there's a lot of strength in terms of seeking help regarding mental health. I think um, there's a lot of shame that goes behind it, that people are like, "Ugh, like I can't believe like I need to ask someone for this, or like it's probably something petty compared to like other people's problems and et cetera, et cetera. But I think taking those steps are really important. Like one of my favorite quotes from Grey's Anatomy, and I don't know if anyone else is a fan, is from Dr. Christina Yang. And she says, being aware of your crap and actually overcoming your crap are two very different things. And that's like always resonated with me when I've seen that episode. Because yes, like knowing that you're struggling with your mental health is like a huge step, right? But then there's also the next step of like, what are you going to do with that knowledge? And again, like going out there and seeking help, or like taking little steps in terms of like answering a question where you're like, oh, how are you? And you're like, not so good. Like those are little tiny steps of you like sharing some concerns that you have, right? So with that said, I guess I'll go into my own little story with my mental health during undergraduate and graduate. So I currently live with depression, anxiety, and both of those kind of really festered during my undergraduate career. Some things that like kind of like played into it was um, I'm a gay like cis male, and one of the things that I did a lot when I was growing up was I equated my self-worth with my grades and my academic performance a lot. And when I got into undergraduate, um, I didn't exactly perform well in certain classes, and that was like a huge hit. And so it started bringing into this question of like, am I really worthy of like being here? And like a lot of imposter syndrome kicking in. On top of that, um, there was this deal of like being the firstborn in my family. So like growing up, I was the primary like language broker, which is like a child from a non-English speaking family having to translate documents for their parents. And so I was the primary language broker, not only for like my central family, but also for some extended family as well. So there was that. There was also guilt, guilt of having to share what's happening with my life right now, right? Not only with my parents, but as I said, with my extended family. And for, not to generalize, but a lot of like Asian families, we're very codependent on one another, right? Like we have like a very strong, not codependent, collective, sorry, family dynamic. And it kind of goes both ways in terms of my perspective. Like it can be very supportive when you need it, but then there are other times when like, like when you're going through this guilt or shame or difficult time, that can also be detrimental to a certain extent, because then you're like, I don't want to share that I'm struggling with all this with my family members who've been there. They've been supporting me, they've made sacrifices, I've seen their struggles, they tell me about their struggles a lot too. And so like what is me like not doing well or like getting a C in a test compared to say like my mom who immigrated to the US over 20 years ago, and she hasn't been back to South Korea in over 20 years and seeing her family and her sisters. Like, what does that compare to like getting a C or getting a bad grade, right? On top of that, like there's also the concern of finances. Like I was working like 20 plus hours like a week, plus doing like 17 hours of classes, plus doing like Lord knows how many other extracurriculars to like boost up my resume to get into like graduate schools and other like competitive programs. And with all of that, like eventually it led to a state of burnt out. Um, and with mental health, it's kind of a thing where like you need to be able to address like what exactly it is that's burning you out. Otherwise, like you're gonna continuously burn out and you're literally running on fumes. And for me, that came to be like a huge issue during my graduate program. Like I ended up having a lot of panic and anxiety attacks because like I was feeling anxious regarding like my grades, imposter syndrome, and not really tackling a lot of like my underlying concerns of like where like a lot of my, I guess, branches of my mental health came from. So I wasn't really targeting the roots. And like right now, currently, I'm in a better place. You know, like I've had a lot of introspection, self reflection, and like I'm good. My mental health is good. But with that said, um, like one of the biggest issues that I had was thinking that this journey of like healing with mental health is a short process. It's like short term. And it's not. It's a lifelong journey. And I know that that may sound daunting to some people. But like mental health is like a lifelong thing. Like you're living with it. And there are tools that you learn along the way, along your journey, that kind of help mitigate some of the effects. And that you also kind of have to learn how to refine these tools. Because just because you have, like, I don't know, like a knife that you had for like 4 years doesn't mean that it's like sharp enough to continue cutting, right? Like, you need to keep, like, um, you need to like clean the edge, clean the blade, and then resharpen it. And that's kind of similar to like these like metaphorical like mental health tools that you have in your toolkit. Like you always have to consistently adjust and um, alternate them to fit your like needs, because the you that you are today isn't necessarily the you that was like from 4 years ago. So that's kind of my like short brief history of my mental health process. Siobhan, you want to share next?
Sure, I can share. Hello, everyone. So, in regards to myself personally and mental health, I also struggle with anxiety and depression. The way I look at it is anxiety has been the luggage that I've been carrying around for years, whereas depression's more like the thing that comes to visit me for vacation. And so I literally deal with anxiety daily. And before I even knew what anxiety was, it was there. I think I had my first panic attack and I was like really, really young. I just come out of the shower and because I've been afraid of death for pretty much most of my life, I just like started hyperventilating and I had no idea what was happening to me. It didn't occur until years later that that's what I realized was happening to me at the time. And I come from a culture where, I mean, it's the dialogue's definitely changing now, but when I was younger, it was kind of like brushed under the rug. It's not really something that people talk about. People don't really talk about, didn't really talk about mental health. And they kind of had these not so great terms that I actually won't repeat when you're referring to someone who was different. And so, in general, growing up, I've been like the shy, like smart girl. And my experiences in middle school weren't necessarily that great. And I was definitely bullied by some of my classmates. And I did actually try going to therapy at the time, but it didn't, I personally don't feel like it helped long term. And it actually brought up a lot of the issues that I had with my biological father that kind of fueled a lot of how I've become who I am today, unfortunately, in some ways, and in some ways, fortunately. So, what I mean by that is struggling with low self esteem and that being so much of the foundation as to why I struggle with anxiety, because sometimes I'm worried about how is someone else going to perceive me. I'm worried about um, being ridiculed or being embarrassed or someone perceiving me the wrong way because I didn't take the time to learn how to love myself. And so that's kind of like the part that I'm at now, is trying to learn that part of the process. But I guess that's the good thing that did come up out of that experience in middle school. And then in general, being the first one to pursue medicine in my family, that's been like a very huge stressor for me, not because people are putting pressure on me, but more so self-induced and wanting to not disappoint anyone and wanting to achieve greatness. And then I feel like my experiences, particularly being at institutions where I was the minority, so being in a predominantly white institution, you often experience that pressure of needing to work so much harder than everyone else just to be viewed at the same level playing field. And then that imposter syndrome comes in. So you're just dealing with so many different things in your head at once. Um, and then being a person of faith, I sometimes struggle with with having mental health issues, because there's this concept of like, where's the spiritual component and how much of this is just like a result of you not making right decisions in the past. And so for a long time, I kind of was like, I had tried that therapy thing in the past. It didn't really work. Like, do I really need to go back? And I did need to go back. And it was something that I realized was it's not necessarily the therapy itself, it's who you're working with. So the therapist I have now is incredible. And I could tell from our first interaction that this was someone who was invested in getting to the deeply rooted issues that I've had since way, 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 way long ago. And so each session that we've had, we're working on tackling those deeply rooted issues that I've had. And they have been such a blessing to me. So I personally believe that everyone could benefit from therapy. And I think it's really helpful to learn about underlying issues that you've been struggling with that you might not have even noticed.
Thank you, Siobhan. And Chris, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Uh, I some of your stories have, uh, I guess, parallels with mine. So I but there are some places where they diverge. For example, I it sounds like Jay, your family is kind of the opposite of mine. My family does not share anything. Um, it and there is no, there's less of that collective feeling, which I think I could have benefited from a lot um, in the past. But I'll uh, I'll take the perspective of just starting the timeline from when I arrived in college. Um, so I started at Georgetown for the first part of my dual bachelor's, and that was the first time I had been away from home, and so it was hard, and I was the first person in my family to go to college, so I didn't have anybody to lean on in terms of like prior experience. Um, I felt alone for that, especially that first year, like acutely alone, and that had a lot of knock-on effects, like feeling uncomfortable going to office hours, feeling uncomfortable, um, even like making friends and putting myself out there. It affected not only how I saw myself, but also my performances in school. Um, and in certain ways, it felt like freshman year didn't exist for me. Like I was just trying to survive and figure out how to be. Um, I had not gone to, I didn't know anything about like therapy or counseling or anything at that point either. Um, and and so for me, the biggest help was finding community. Like it was, the logical response to feeling alone is to find people that you could feel less alone with. And so it was for me. That's uh, two main things: the Vietnamese Student Association at school. So growing up in South Florida, there were like zero zero Asians, let alone Vietnamese people. And so there really, there wasn't that big of a community anyway. And so this was like a novel idea, the fact that there could be more than three Vietnamese people of the same age from different families in the same like room. Like that was a revelation for me. And so finding that community was very helpful, but also finding the a community. So that's like the cultural, ethnic side of my identity that I had never really like tapped into before, and that helped a lot. But also on the class side, on the like parental education side, Georgetown has a very unique program uh, that has become less and less unique as more schools have adopted that model, and that's the Georgetown Scholars Program, GSP. So like that. So I joined that spring um, of my freshman year, and now all of a sudden I had a community of people who could understand like what it was like to be the first person in your family to go to college. What was it like to come from a working class background? Uh, you know, everybody, not everybody, but like almost everybody on my freshman floor like did not understand what that felt like. You know, and did not understand what it felt like to feel like did I actually deserve to come to Georgetown? Do I actually have what it takes to finish college here? I thought about transferring back to back home to uh, like a community college that recently turned into a 4-year school, closer to home. Like um, I just wasn't sure if that was Georgetown was the place for me until I found those communities. And that that community helped me gain some agency, some control over who I was and who I wanted to be, and that led to me starting Align. I met uh, some other students at Georgetown who had independently come up with the idea of starting a conference for first gen low income students, and so we worked together to co-found Align. That wouldn't have happened if I hadn't persisted, and that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't found some community. So that was Georgetown. Then, so I did 3 years there. For the last 2 years of my program, I was at Columbia, and there I realized that imposter syndrome doesn't ever leave. I felt it all over again. I was like, you know what? Like I know what it's like to be, to start school again. Like I'm not a freshman anymore. I'm the equivalent of a senior now. Uh, and yet I felt it. Like I yeah, I had the same feelings over again. It was extra surprising because I didn't expect it this time. Um, and uh, so that was a key realization for me. Um, Columbia was a little different than Georgetown, though. Georgetown had a lot of processes in place for you to find community. They had a Students of Color Association. Um, Columbia at that time did have a fledgling one, but it wasn't as robust. And there wasn't a lot of cross-cultural students, like events and community and friendships. Um, that didn't really happen. It was just a harder environment for everybody, not just first gen low income students of color, but just for everybody. Um, there were and yeah, and the infrastructure for mental health was a little weaker there as well compared to Georgetown. Georgetown had a dedicated psychologist for first gen low income students. Um, they hired GSP, Georgetown Scholars Program, hired their own psychologist dedicated to their students in the program. That's a very novel concept, at the time when that happened, which was only like 2-3 years ago or something like that. The name's Dr. Daniel Phillip. I don't know if he's still there now. Columbia doesn't have that. Most schools don't have that, to be honest. Um, and but yeah, so Columbia was all about like learning to do all of that all over again. To find that community, to take care of myself, to believe in myself. And then after graduating, um, I entered the working world, and I realized that it's a lot easier out here in many ways when you have a schedule that's like 9 to 5, and you can't take work home. I work specifically in a job where I can't take my work home, and that separation between life and work is very, very important. And as I'm going back to grad school, that's going to be something that I'm going to try to do to maintain that life work separation. Um, I guess the last thing I'll add is burnout, especially amongst organizers. You guys in the Steve Fund and the Youth Advisory Board, you guys, aren't like this. This isn't your like salaried job, right? Um, or maybe it is. I don't know. But like, if it's not, it's harder. Um, and it's not for me and Michaela, my co-executive director. Like, we have our full-time jobs, and then we come home at night, and then we work on Align, or we do it during the weekend. Uh, and this is not just Align; it's everybody in the ecosystem of student organizers or like young people organizers. Like, everybody gets burnt out, no matter how like excellent you are. And so protecting against that is really important, and we're still trying to figure it out. Um, so yeah, that's where I am now. That's my story.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Chris. I think you made some like amazing points in terms of pointing out like imposter syndrome, burnt out, and also just the need for like community and to like find community because as you were mentioning like Georgetown, like your GSP program kind of um, like made space for that. And like I 100% agree with you. Like during my freshman year, we also had like freshman incoming programs or whatnot. That was kind of to facilitate those conversations, but they were made primarily by like major, so not necessarily like other identifiers. And as a result of which, like some of my incoming group, like we didn't bond as much as we could. Like we weren't able to share our experiences, and I think that's like another thing that's like really important for like first gen and then like other like minority populations, like to be able to like have other people like within your own community that you identify with, to be able to like have these conversations and be like, oh my gosh, like it's not just me, like I'm not the only one that's struggling right now, or like I'm not the only one that has to juggle all these like other intersections while trying to quote unquote like succeed through like whatever these like higher education programs or requirements are asking for me. So I guess kind of like I think you like kind of touched upon it. Like one of the questions that I have for us is like, what was your toughest semester like during undergraduate, and like why? Oh, I don't mind if I want me to go first. Okay, so mine was definitely sophomore year. Freshman year was a little easier because of that like incoming group more or less. But in terms of sophomore year, that's when a lot of your like elective courses and your other like free choice courses start kicking in. And that's when you're like really kind of like free balling in terms of like what you want to achieve with your career, right? Because you're like, okay, the next 3 years is like really where it really starts. Like freshman year is more um, setting a foundation. And for me, like I honestly can't remember like sophomore year a lot. Like I don't know if it's because I like repressed the memory or stuff, but like I literally can't remember. Like that was this like sophomore year was the worst year for me in terms of my depression. Like that was when it was like full throttle. Like I would literally go through the motions of everything. Um, and I would just be laying in bed. I think like most of sophomore year was like me laying in bed, just on my phone, like looking for other things to do because I was like, I can't do this. Like I can't do school. I can't talk to people. Like I'm just gonna stay home. Like I'm gonna stay home, eat. That's it. Um, and that was a. It was tough in terms of like trying to get back from it, right? Both mentally, physically, and then academically, because obviously that was not my best academic year. And so like I'm still kind of facing like the consequences of that, but also realizing that like the things that you learn from like those struggles like are really helpful in terms of like future like obstacles or problems that come into place. But like that was my sophomore year. What about y'all?
Mine was actually also my sophomore year. So it was like my freshman year went pretty okay. And then sophomore year, I was like, oh, I can take on this course and I can handle that course. And that was not the case. My course load definitely was a little too dense for me. And one of my courses, I got a C minus in, and I was going back and forth about whether or not I should repeat the course, like how would that be perceived? And because as pre-med, when it was a course, it was organic chemistry one, I believe. It was like you kind of do have to repeat it because that's one of those classes they call like the weed out classes, and it's a class that you're expected to do at least well in. By a lot of people. And so I did end up having to actually repeat the course and dealing with that, like, oh my goodness, I have to take this class again. Like, how are they going to look at that on the application? And just that mental like struggle of just going back and forth, like, oh wow, maybe I really am not good enough for this, or maybe I'm not equipped to do what I want to do. And so having to repeat that course was definitely challenging mentally, but ultimately I was successful in completing that course, and I ended up getting a letter of recommendation from that professor, it was a different, let me rephrase, a different professor, the one that I took the class with the second time. Yeah, sorry about that, I said that wrong. But the professor that I retook the class with, I got a letter of recommendation for medical school from him. So that was really awesome.
My hardest semester was not sophomore year. It might not even have been freshman year, in which I did struggle a lot. I think it might have been either my last semester at Columbia, so like last of my 10 semesters in undergrad, or maybe the second to last semester, because that was when Align was happening, that first conference, and that burnout hit hard. Uh, so much harder than like it was harder than feeling alone. It was harder than the imposter syndrome. Um, that because I mean, yeah, it was just a different kind of stress. It was when I had my first panic attack, um, and yeah. So I'm not sure if I want to. Well,
You don't have to if you don't want to, Chris.
it's not so much about what I want, but I'm not sure if it's going to make Columbia look good. Um,
Maybe
yeah,
not then.
Hey,
Maybe not
yeah.
because
I'm gonna leave that. I'm gonna
hey,
completely.
as someone who's graduating from Columbia, just, just do it. Just do it.
well, so here's the other thing though, Erica. I don't know if Chris is potentially thinking of like hitting up Columbia for an Align conference later on. So
Oh, well,
Well, honestly, Columbia is not that good when it comes to the fly community, so
yeah, yeah. That's that's their that's their MO. That's their brand, really. We so Align was supposed, so we wanted to hold it at Columbia where I was. That made the most sense. Columbia wasn't the first host of Align. Columbia never hosted Align. Barnard College across the street hosted Align. They were the ones who gave us permission to use their space, and they were the like their admin and staff were the ones who let us host it. So yeah, Columbia has like no history with Align technically, besides using the Learner Center for like our fun Saturday night activity. So I'll leave it off. I'll leave it off. But there were additional reasons: institutional, structural, environment, cultural reasons why that senior year was particularly hard for me. In addition to the stressors that I imposed on myself, organizing a lot.
yeah, and I think to like add on to that, like it's really difficult for like at least in my experience, like when you're like so passionate about something and you like really want to see it done, and then there are like so many things that are like coming up, and you're like, oh my gosh, like maybe this isn't going to be happening, but I already put so much effort into it, and da 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 da, and like really trying to like push yourself forward, and it's really difficult, like you're mentioning, Chris, especially when you're already burnt out, when you're already like at like negative 10% on your battery and you're like, I need to keep pushing forward to get this through. um, Another thing that I forgot to mention for my sophomore year was like I was having issues with toxic relationships, which I've never faced before. Not like romantic relationships, but like more platonic. um, and like what we were kind of discussing in terms of community, like those friendships that I had like were part of the community that I had built for myself in undergraduate to kind of like help me go through. But it was like really difficult for me to like cut those connections because then I would be like diminishing that community and that support group. And at that point in time, it was like a pros and cons thing where I'm like, okay, if I do it, then like maybe my mental health and like additional stressors will be fine. But then like I also don't have that social support, and then like vice versa. So that was like an additional thing I was going through sophomore year. I forgot to mention. Um, Next question. As like students of color, like what have been some difficult situations that you have experienced or heard about like on campus or around your campus that affected your mental health?
Um, I guess my first incident really was in high school, or few incidents were in high school. I remember specifically when I was going through the college application process and I started getting acceptances, and I got accepted to the school that it was pretty decent in terms of their reputation. And I actually had a teacher come up to me and was like, "Oh, you got accepted into that school?" And honestly, that's something that I know I need to let go, but it's something that just it kind of stuck with me for a really long time. It's like really frustrating that someone could just make this assumption about what kind of school I will and will not be accepted to because of what I look like. Because I was never a student of that person. Like they never taught me or anything like that to speak about my academic abilities or what I was capable of. But they looked at me kind of like, how did you get into that school? And they didn't say it that way, but that's what it translated as. And so that was one of the things that just rubbed me the wrong way from the beginning. And then this is more so specifically to my experiences being a woman of color and having natural hair, but I've definitely, myself and my friends have had instances where people have touched our hair and just invaded our personal space, some with asking and many times without asking. And that's an issue that's like really a separate conversation, but just like being in an environment where people think it's okay to kind of invade your personal space like that has been challenging at times. And then I think there was an incident specifically on my college campus where they have like those campus rocks where like people put advertisements and things like that. And so one of the Black sororities on campus had advertised something on that rock, and a white fraternity basically like sprayed over it and did their own thing, and it turned into a huge thing on campus and like in terms of repercussions for that fraternity. And it was just very stressful. I think that was my senior year, and I just remember starting to feel so uneasy and a little bit unsafe rather while on campus as a Black woman. So those are some of the experiences that I've had personally.
Yeah. I think on my campus, so, okay, there were a lot of incidences when I was there, unfortunately. A lot of it did end up happening from like the Greek life, because like we have like on campus like residential areas, but we have like off campus apartments, which are literally like a block away from the campus. And a lot of time there were a lot of hate crimes happening. I think there was an incident where like a Black student was like walking underneath like one of the balconies from the apartments, and like a student threw like a bleach balloon down on them. There are also instances where like Greek life, again, they're like literally like on the other side of campus of the street. They were throwing these like racist parties about um, like undocumented people, primarily like Mexican people, and um, all sorts of these things, and then the administration not really condoning it, not what's the other word of condoning? Just y'all know what I mean. Like they're not like saying anything wrong about it. They're kind of
Not addressing it, dismissing it.
dismissing. Yeah, they were kind of like dismissive of it, and they're like, well, we can't really do anything because it's not technically on campus. And I'm like, it's across the street. Like, how is that not related? It involves your students. It's across the street. How is that not a thing? Um, and so, like, I think those instances, at least from me, like I know, like I have privilege being like an Asian American. Like I know that I'm still like considered like a person of color, but I know there's privilege that exists like within the Asian community that doesn't necessarily exist for the Black and Brown community, unfortunately. And I know that a lot of my like Black and Brown friends were going like I'm just kind of like, I don't know, like it was just like a whole thing of like they're not being seen, they're not being heard, and there's a lack of support. And in a way, it kind of creates a precedence for these like students to like continue these actions, which I was like, that's not okay, like at all. Like this doesn't help your students because this is saying that they don't have space here. Like they're guests. They're not like actually supposed to belong, which is like a whole issue in itself. Um, but yeah, long tangent, different conversation, like Siobhan said. Chris?
I don't remember anything from my Georgetown years. Um, that was a while ago, 2012 to 2015. From Columbia, Erica, you might have to help me out because you were there more recently. I also don't really.
Personally, I didn't
Yeah.
have any incident within Colombia, just outside of Colombia.
Yeah, I mean, it's being right in the middle of the city. Also, like, you know, the barriers are very porous, right? You have just life interacting with the school and school interacting with life.
Yeah.
Obviously the school, and actually both schools I went to, have a history of taking advantage of uh, Black and Brown communities, especially Black
Yeah.
communities.
Mm-hmm.
Like Columbia. So Georgetown only very, very recently like recognized like the descendants of the slaves who built the school, and then Columbia, was has a history of claiming, pieces of Morningside Heights
Mm-hmm.
from historical neighborhoods. But in the present day, I don't remember anything on campus. So
Okay. So not to pry too much, Erica, you don't have to share, but like, what are some things that you were mentioning in terms of like around campus that were happening?
Let's see. There was an incident outside of campus. I was with my boyfriend at the time. We were at Bryant Park, and then randomly some guy said I should be deported. This was like 2 years ago, so it was like a year or so after the election that happened. But it triggered me. It took me a while to calm down, and then when I talked to the guy, I made him feel stupid, which was just mission accomplished. But that did stuck with me for a while because I never expected in the city. I expected like some like that to happen outside the city, because New York City is very diverse. But I guess it doesn't matter.
Thank you for sharing that, Erica. Like, and I like all the more like power to you, like putting that person in his place, regarding that. And I am sorry that that happened. Um, but and so I guess like there's no like good way to like segue into this, but and like another question that I have for like everyone else is like, what are some things that you do when you're struggling? Like, how do you know that your mental health is deteriorating? And then what are things that you do to kind of offset it or help you along?
I think for me, it's to talk to people that I know that are struggling, that have the same struggles or have been through there, and that way they could offer advice on how to go through it.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, for me, it's identifying. It's harder for me, I think, to identify when I'm starting to struggle. I usually find out when it's like far too late. Um, um, the telltale sign for me is like burrowing, finding myself burrowing, uh, like binging YouTube videos, and then like not realizing that it's like 3 in the morning. Um, like behavior like that for me is an indicator that like I'm starting to um, get my 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 burnout has arrived basically. So then it's when I realize that, then I start to try to uh, make a note of what I should be dialing down, taking notes on my journaling. Basically, yeah, I guess basically is what I do. um, I journal. I tend to journal more during those periods, and that's when I double down on separating life and work. Like, I will no longer work on a line at night. I will only work on it during the weekends only. That kind of thing.
For me, as a now faculty member, I've gone through many, many years of grad school and undergrad and trying to figure out what the best tactic is. And one that I think helps the most is, that, do y'all know that, that meme with that guy who throws all his papers up in the air and it's like, kind of like, fuck it. Like, it's just like this guy just throws all his papers in there. It's like, whatever. So I feel like during a normal day, during a normal week or month, we all have these to-do lists, and we want to get each thing on the list done in a certain amount of time, and we have these like expectations and goals and dreams. But when it gets to that moment where I'm like, okay, the anxiety's kicking in or depression's kicking in, I kind of just like do a major release, and I'm like, okay, here's the to-do list, but it's okay if it doesn't get done. It's okay if things take double or triple. I'm not going to let anybody tell me that I'm going too slow. I'm not going to let anybody tell me that I'm supposed to be doing something. I'm just going to sleep if I want to sleep and not check these if I don't want to check these. And I think that that's been really helpful to actually get the things done on the list, like with no pressure to do them. So that's been helping me. I try to like, whenever people ask me for advice, especially like grad students, I tell them like, this, it might seem very hard to do because we have all these pressures from our very prestigious universities telling us that we have to always be working, but it takes some practice. But over grad school, especially my PhD, like nothing fell apart. Everything was fine. I would take whole weekends off, and sometimes people didn't even notice. So I think that would be some advice for me, and something that I constantly practice is that as soon as I see myself getting tired or going into that part of like the depression, anxiety, I'm like, okay, well, everything is lifted. My diet doesn't matter. I'm going to eat all the ice cream. I'm going to do the stuff on my list in whatever order I want. And that's been pretty helpful.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Nydia. I think for me, I love that you're like, it's just like a thing of like, I'm gonna do whatever I need to right now to care for me, and then everyone else can just take a back seat right now. Love that. For me, I think, and yes, I know I'm a biology nerd. I kind of like to don't laugh at me, Siobhan. I like to think of my depression as kind of like the cell cycle in a way. And there are like certain checkpoints for it to like progress to the next step and then to the next step and to the next step. And for me, it's taken me a really long time in terms of like knowing what like my neck, like the checkpoints are. Like, oh, if I'm doing like these certain behaviors, like what Chris was saying, like burrowing or like looking for avoidant techniques, like that means I'm going into this next step of my like depression that could potentially lead into my depression. Um, and like sometimes like I'm able to catch it and be like, oh, like this is a checkpoint. Like, okay, like these are what I found to like be useful toolkits, which is like talking to people, like reaching out to like family, journaling, like chasing my cat around, trying to get cuddles with him. um, or just doing like a little like art therapy where I'm just splattering paint. Like other ways are like walking around, singing. I go on long drives sometimes and I just sing on the top of my lungs because apparently it's not a social norm for a grown man to be singing really loud at the top of his lungs in an apartment by himself because your neighbors start knocking. So I do it alone in my car, and if people watch me, I just stare back at them and I just shimmy at them. Um, but that's how I found it very useful in terms of like really doing a lot of introspection and kind of finding checkpoints of like, okay, like this is stage one, now I'm at stage two. How can I stop myself from going to stage three and kind of keep myself at stage two or go back to stage one? So that's me.
That's such a beautiful analogy. I really love that. That's great. Cell cycle. It's nice. I think for me, probably some similar things like singing in the car is actually become my favorite thing. Like I used to love singing in the shower. I still do that, but singing in the car, like I think you're so free of all inhibitions and like no one else can hear you. It's just you and you're having your moment with yourself to just reflect. And I really enjoy doing that. So when I get my car back, I will go back to doing that. Music in general is just, I don't know, the way that you're able to connect with music, all different types as well. That's been definitely the biggest, probably the main thing that I use to just deal when I'm going through some difficult times. And then like you hear a lot about breathing exercises and it really makes a difference. It's like something so simple. We do it every day, breathing, but like really focusing on your breathing, how much that calms you down. That's been very helpful for me as well.
Yeah. And So like I know that some people are like really weird about breathing because they're like breathing is like meditation, and I'm like it can be meditation, but like if you just I don't know, I do what is it? I think it's like the 5-4-3 technique. Is that what you do? So like for everyone who's like wondering, it's like 5 seconds you're breathing in through your nose, like 4 seconds you're holding it in, and then 3 seconds you're blowing it out like through your mouth, and then like you kind of keep going through that. But yeah, I don't know. Anyway, before we close out, because it's around that time, are there any resources that anyone wants to share?
I don't have any resources, but I literally didn't know it was possible to breathe in continuously for 5 seconds. But I just tried, so I can't confirm. I didn't explode.
So I guess for me, the crisis line, 741-741, you can either text help, or you can text Steve. The Steve Fund actually has like our own separate like partnership with them. And the Steve one is for like primarily like people of color. You can reach out to that. For like LGBT listeners, if you're there, Trevor Project, they're really cool. You can reach out to them as well. For some student advocates who are interested, the Steve Fund does like a partnership with the Jed Foundation, and they like created something called the Equity and Mental Health Framework, which are like 10 like research-based like suggestions and objectives that schools can kind of implement to provide like better diversity, inclusivity for like students of color. And then the Youth Advisory Board, like we're here. If y'all want to reach out, our application's still open until like May 1st, senseless plug, I know. And you guys can go ahead and do that. And then finally, we also have something called Community Conversations, which is on May 7th at 3 p.m. from the Steve Fund. And it's about mental health providers supporting clients of color and how we can provide like self-care techniques and a community of care for y'all, because we know that mental health providers are also struggling with their mental health at this time. So
all of these resources, can you send us like a short like
no.
all in one place? Okay, well I guess did you guys write that down then?
Yeah, I'll send that over.
Okay, so we'll post that when we in our YouTube video description, and then also like on our listserv, on our Facebook, on our website. So it's like it's a mini stop shop, but you can get it in any one place. And also in terms of if people want to reach out to you guys, maybe if not your personal emails, then at least like your Steve Fund like email. Was it YAB@SteveFund?
YAB@stevefund.org. And then I guess before we close out, Erica or Nydia, do y'all have any other questions, comments, concerns?
I have a what might be considered as a resource, not necessarily like a website or anything, but I think there's also a way to reframe getting mental health resources or reaching out. One of them being that being able to address your mental health is a privilege that not a lot of people have. And sometimes we might feel guilty about addressing our mental health because our families may have in the past or still are dealing with like more basic, quote unquote, more basic needs. And so they don't have that privilege of being able to address their mental health or engage in self-care kind of practices. But the way I reframe it is that, our ancestors and our community and our previous generations fought really hard for us to have this moment where we finally do have that ability and privilege to take care of ourselves. And so they took care of it for us a little bit, right? They fought really hard to get us basic rights and to get us to be at this moment now where we're at this privilege, and we can sit here and talk for an hour about mental health and tell our stories. So in a way, for me, whenever I feel a little bit of guilt, I always remind myself that my mom, my aunts, my grandparents, they worked really, really hard to get to this country and to get to a place where now I don't have to worry about those, kind of more basic, incredibly important things. And now I can focus on another important thing, which is my mental health. So I kind of owe it to them in a way. So whenever you feel guilty or whenever friends feel guilty, you can maybe reframe it that way. And it's really helped me kind of keep going and keep working on my self-care and mental health.
I have a comment. I just want to say thank you for providing a space, especially at a time like this. I think it's really important to talk about mental health and how we are and reflecting and all of that.
Yeah, thank you, Erica, and thank you, Nydia. Without other things or comments to talk about, I think I'll let Chris handle the closing remarks.
Sure. I'll admit that coming into this session, I was a noob, and I'm still a noob because an hour doesn't really change much. But like some of what you brought up, some of especially strategies for dealing. I didn't know what the 5-4-3 method was because I didn't know my lung capacity. But that's just being facetious. Like you know, I've I have a lot more to learn personally in terms of how to take care of myself and how to recognize where I can be better at taking care of myself and when I'm not doing well. Um, and so yeah, I think if it was helpful for me, hopefully it's helpful for other people too. I wish more people joined us, but hopefully people watching on YouTube afterwards will be able to get something out of this. So like, you guys are doing really good work. If this is like the quality of your sessions, then like I want to continue pointing aligners your way. So we'll definitely do that. We did already share the youth advisory board application with our listserv. So hopefully people will be applying, and yeah, we'll put all the resources that you had mentioned on uh, our various platforms. But yeah, most of all, just thank you very much for taking the time and for sharing your stories, and also for encouraging me to share mine. I hadn't really before, and it was kind of cathartic.
I'm glad. It seemed like you, I don't know, like for like a supposed noob, like it was a very intuitive and very like honest reflection. And I thank you for that.
I mean, that's why I went off camera for like 10 minutes so I could like write things down. But
Okay.
yeah, so I guess is that it for everybody? Any more questions or comments from you or from you, Jay or Siobhan as well? All right, cool. In that case, thank you very much for joining. This is probably going to be the last recorded session of Align Online 2020. So thank you very, very much for joining, and stay safe, stay healthy, take care of yourselves and each other. And yeah, thanks again for joining. Take care.
Thanks. Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care, everyone.